Oh, I'll come back. So Shashi, let me come back to you. We spoke about the G10, Mr. Park said. Mr. Park said G10, another group of countries which is more coherent, more cohesive. Now, when you're talking of coherence and cohesiveness, we're actually talking of gated communities. Now, can these gated communities solve the problems of the world? Or we need something like the G20 or a bigger organization, perhaps, which is a divided house, which will be a divided house. But it is better to debate in a divided house than reach consensus in an echo chamber.
Yeah, I think we're slightly guilty of a confusion of terms here. Multilateralism has always implied a certain universalism. Multilateral solutions involve, for example, the United Nations, the worldwide organizations. What we're seeing increasingly with these smaller groupings is what really is plurilateralism. It's a number of countries. India has become a bit of an ace at that. Our foreign minister meets with his Chinese and Russian counterparts in RIC. Then he adds the Brazilians and the South Africans, and he goes and attends BRICS. Then we take out the Russians and the Chinese, and we have IPSA for South-South cooperation. And then we add the Chinese, but not the Russians, and you have BASIC for environmental negotiations. And I don't think India is there only because its name starts with that most essential element in any acronym, a vowel, but because it actually has something to contribute in these different formulae. But those are all plurilateral. What about the larger era multilateralism? Now, I was at the UN in the heyday of multilateralism. I'd say probably we can date it from 1990 to 2010 or so, when you actually saw the emergence at the end of the Cold War, of the end of that Cold War binary, the rise of briefly what was called the unipolar moment, transitioning, it seemed to many of us, into some sort of multipolarity. But we've gone a long way since there's been a triple crisis confronting all of this. You've seen a crisis very much of legitimacy, of representation of the universal bodies. It's already been alluded to, but the Security Council, where a handful of Western countries has 50% of the voting strength, whereas, let's say, 54 African countries have 2 seats out of 15. Or you can look at the IMF, where literally 5 countries have 38.8% of the voting strength, and you have more than half the world's population getting about 3%. So you've got a real problem in terms of the crisis of representation in the world. Then you've got the more recent backlash against globalization, which has created a new crisis of people, for example, in the developed world, which sold the rest of us globalization, suddenly finding that their own working classes are asking why their jobs have been shanghaied to taken off to other countries. And there's a backlash there, which has also got a cultural dimension with the resistance to foreigners and so on. And it's manifested itself in Brexit. It's manifested itself in the US briefly pulling out of WHO and so on, countries pulling out of UNESCO, so that multilateral organizations have suddenly seemed much less attractive to all of them. And in this kind of world order confusion, there is a crisis of the collective. And the rise of plurilateralism is actually a reflection of crisis, not so much of the joyous verities of multilateralism. Because if you're going to be sitting around in smaller groups at a time when the world, as the Korean foreign minister just said, needs multilateralism more than ever, how are you going to get there? The honest truth right now, Sanjoy, is that...
Shashi, an agnostic plurilateralism, the kind you say certain countries like adopt, will be part of grouping A, will be part of grouping B. Is an agnostic plurilateralism the substitute of straddling the way forward to straddle some of the divides we've spoken about? Are these the countries which will be in a position to straddle the divide between the North and the South, between the East and the West?
But I think if you phrase it that way, you still have to look at the broader, look at the recent geopolitics of the world, right? We've had both the pandemic and Ukraine dramatically demonstrating to us how much multilateralism is under crisis. The pandemic and our failure to respond to it as ideally we might have liked, even at the regional level, even within Europe, the first reaction was to throw up the barriers. Suddenly the whole Schengen agreement, which was such a dream for European integration, disappeared. There were borders coming up between Schengen countries. Poor Italy became the first European country to get COVID. What did the European neighbors do? They shut it down. They actually wouldn't let people, medicines, etc., travel into Italy. I know they recovered from that, but I'm just saying we saw a world in which the first reaction to the pandemic everywhere was every nation for itself. Today, I'm sorry to say, Lord Ahmed, Britain is about to throw away vast quantities of vaccines because you essentially ended up acquiring 3 times more than your population needed to vaccinate your people against COVID, whereas African countries waited and waited for vaccines and never came. So where is global solidarity and multilateralism under the pandemic? The Ukraine war, another crisis, where you've seen a permanent member of the Security Council violating the sovereignty of a member state of the UN, and nobody could do very much about it. And indeed, we're going on now for quite some time with that crisis. So when you look at these particular institutions, these smaller ones, they actually evade the central question of our time, which is how do we rescue multilateralism at a global level, give it credibility, make it work without these triple crises that I've talked about, and without the kind of issues that we've seen both through the pandemic and through Ukraine, which have undermined us so profoundly.
So we have three interventions. I'll bring them in the order I've got them.
My worry simply is that I've heard all of these things before the pandemic and Ukraine, and they still happen. So we know what we have to do. And I think we all agree with each other on the verities. The challenge is when the next pandemic comes up, will we have the ability to concert our positions, identify the virus early, take action to prevent its spread? Will the WHO be able to send experts to the country where they believe it originated without their visas being denied? The next time there is something like Ukraine looming, will we be in a situation where America and Britain are screaming from the rooftops for 7 weeks that an invasion is about to happen, and the UN Secretary General doesn't get on a plane and go to either Moscow or Kiev and see what he can do to prevent it? Where can we imagine the next time things will be better than the last time? That's my hope. I am a convinced multilateralist. I spent 29 years of my life advocating it. My worry is, we all know what should be done, but when the crisis comes, when the crunch comes, will we all have the political will to actually do it? Or will we see what happened over the last few years recurring?
So actually,
that's the question.
On a more heartening note, that's a more heartening note we're concluding on, and the right conclusion for this panel. Yes, there is a problem, but there is far too much at stake for multilateralism to really fail. And when push comes to shove, the world better find some way to get back to multilateral arrangements, either through plurilateralism or whichever way they form, basically by misdirections, find some direction out towards multilateralism. So with that, I think please give the panelists a hand. We had a great debate. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It was a pleasure hosting you.